we have been grappling with this question: what kind of a state African countries have, or what kind of the African state has evolved over time, and maybe what kind of the state or leadership is required by the African people. So without wasting a lot of time, let me introduce briefly Professor Adebayo Olukoshi. Is one of the prominent scholars in Africa. I don't have his current CV, but from my own understanding is that at one time he was the executive secretary of CODESRIA, the Council for the Development of Social Science Research. He was very active in that. He has been teaching in several universities in Africa and beyond. He has been serving in international organizations, several international organizations, very high capacity, and so on. And I think currently he's also a distinguished professor at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. He is from Nigeria. The second one is Professor Musambai Katumanga. He's from the University of Nairobi. He's not new to most of us here. He's also a prominent scholar coming from the Department of Political Science and Public Administration. He has at some point in time here, he was also our external examiner at the University of Dar Es Salaam. Professor Benedetta Killian, most of us, we know her. He's also from the Department of Political Science and Public Administration, and currently he's the Deputy Vice Chancellor Research at the University of Dar es Salaam. So each panels will be given 20 minutes to present, and then we'll have a general discussion for all three presentations. So Professor Olukoshi, welcome.
Thank you very much indeed, panel chair, and thank you for the kind introduction and welcome. Good afternoon, distinguished colleagues, compatriots, students, ladies, gentlemen. I'm really very delighted to be back in Dar es Salaam. I was saying to colleagues that in 2 years of COVID, when nobody could move, and a few years before, I think my last visit here was actually to participate also in this festival, just before Professor Issa Shivji left the chair. And I felt when I got the invitation that coming back home to Dar es Salaam was an opportunity not to be missed, as much for the chance to reconnect with many friends and comrades, but also as my own way of paying a personal tribute to the memory of Mwalimu Nyerere, for whom this year's festival coincides with Centennial. I had the distinct privilege and honor, I was whispering to President Kikwete yesterday, of serving with Mwalimu Nyerere in the last 2 years of his life, when he recruited me to join him at the South Center in Geneva. Reference has been made to the South Commission, and the South Commission, which Mwalimu headed, was immediately succeeded by the South Commission, South Center, headquartered in Geneva, to implement the recommendations of the South Commission that he had headed. And he invited me to lead the Africa program of the South Center, right to the end of his life, actually, when he left us in Geneva to go to hospital in London. It was clear that it was a kind of goodbye, given the nature of his ailment. So I really feel very much honored to be here. I wasn't terribly excited, though, by the topic which Professor Mukandala gave to me. And I felt that this is almost like a setup, considering that Mukandala, one of the most prolific of our political scientists on the continent, and myself have been involved over the last 30 years in many conversations about the African state. And there is no state, I would argue, anywhere in the world, or perhaps to be more modest, in the developing world, that has had more adjectival characterizations than the African state. At a point in time in the debates which we had in the 1980s and 1990s, I counted nothing less than 22 adjectives used to describe the African state, from the very benign notion of the post-colonial state or the post-independent state, and to what Nkrumah and others popularized as the neo-colonial state, which was much debated on this campus, on this hill, in the context of the works of the Dar Es Salaam school, to the various epithets that came to be applied in the context of the politics of economic reform and structural adjustment in the course of the 1990s. The unsteady state, the unbalanced state, the shadow state, the sultani state, and talking of the Leviathan chair, there was even a scholar, Thomas Callaghy, who described the African state as the lame Leviathan, a lame Leviathan, which again, unpacked by another American political scientist, Karl Rosberg, was translated as a state that was omnipotent, omnipresent, but hardly omnipotent, right? A juridical fiction, according to another scholar, exercising sovereignty because of the United Nations, but really completely absent on the ground, unable to exercise effective power and legitimacy on the ground. All of this explained in the context of what some refer to as the crisis of neo-patrimonialism, in which the state was enmeshed, a state which essentially existed in the context of the capturing and the distribution of rents, which spoke to the nature of leadership, of the post-colonial leadership, according to that school of thought, that enabled elites to accumulate power and resources for themselves, whilst simultaneously underdeveloping the African state. Now, of course, that whole notion of the post-colonial state as a lame Leviathan actually ran contrary to where we started off, Prof. Mukandala, if you recall. It was with the idea of Hamza Alavi. Hamza Alavi, an Asian political scientist who had done some work in Africa and did a comparison between the post-colonial African state and the state in South Asia, and came up with the idea of the state as being overdeveloped. From being an overdeveloped state in the 1960s, in the way in which it was conceptualized, we came almost to the full circle to discussions in the 80s and 90s that spoke of the state now in terms of a weak institutional contraption that was not only a problem unto itself, but also a problem for society. And how to get out of that problem became the stuff of much of the reforms which we saw in the course of the 1990s and which continue to this day. Reforms which were undertaken across the board, including, for example, the notion of getting the state right in terms of its size, and the idea that the state had come to play an over-determinant role in the economy through its interventions, and it needed to be downsized. Later on, of course, we reacted to the notion of downsizing, and it was refined to right-sizing the state. Right-sizing the African state, which effectively meant retrenchment. If you decode the language of reform, it effectively meant retrenchment in the civil service, privatization, commercialization, and liquidation of most public enterprises and parastatals. And that became an important element of the reform agenda of the 1990s, to be supplemented in a subsequent phase by ideas about capacity building. And you needed now, in the context of a right-sized state, to begin to build capacity. Not just any capacity, but a capacity to be able to implement reforms, especially of a structural adjustment nature, some of which we heard from our keynote speaker yesterday. The content of that structural adjustment program comprising essentially the construction of a market-friendly economy superintended by a night watchman state, a slimmed down state that was reduced to the barest minimum in order not to create distortions in the market, but which was also given the responsibility of providing all of the incentives required for the market to function properly. A bit of a contradiction there. You starve the person and you tell them to run a marathon on a starvation diet and expect them to perform. But nevertheless, that was the nature of the conversation that took place and of the policies which were pursued, and capacity building became almost like the buzzword towards the end of the 1990s. And we were very busy as Africans building capacity. Many countries, I think I counted 22 at the time, actually created ministries of capacity building. Ministries of capacity building for the states. When all of this, of course, ran their course, we then began to move into what we called phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 civil service reforms. I'm sure you went through that in Tanzania, right? Almost an endless cycle of civil service reforms that then were followed by financial sector reforms, especially public finance reforms of various kinds which were introduced. And what is remarkable to me as a student of comparative politics is that regardless of the size of the African economy, regardless of the nature of that economy, regardless of the precise problem that they may have been confronting, we were almost always all implementing the same thing at the same time. Almost always. If Tanzania was doing civil service reform phase 1, it would be a matter of time before Zimbabwe will begin to do the same thing, and Nigeria will begin to do the same thing, essentially speaking to a homogenization of the problem of the African state, as though the state in Africa was itself homogeneous and confronted with exactly the same set of problems. A product, of course, of the framework within which the problematic of the state was conceptualized. If I was to live my life all over again, Professor Mukandala, I would take a totally different approach. And I can reel out the debates that we have had, but I think that's not going to help us insofar as we do not address the question as Africans of what exactly the purpose of the state should be for us. Why do we need a state? And why does that state have to take a particular form? And does that form have to be universal across the board? And I think these are fundamental questions which the extant literature and conventional wisdom will never allow us to answer effectively unless we step back from it altogether. And in my own recent reflection on this question, I have zeroed in on what I have called the central importance of the discovery of collective dignity in the transformation of state and society. That if we look at the story of countries that have been described as successful, whether historically or in the contemporary world, we will find that actually there's one story that runs through all of their experiences. And that is the story of a people, including their elite, quote unquote, getting to a point in their history where they say enough is enough and never again. Take the story of England and the Cromwellian Revolution. Take the story of the French Revolution and the fight for dignity. Move out of Europe and go to the United States and the making of the American Revolution. The slogan of no taxation without representation, of a constitution that was anti-monarchical, thinking back to the absolutism of monarchy in Europe, and insisting as a preamble to that constitution that we hold these truths to be evident, that all people are born equal. And move on to Japan and the story of the Meiji Restoration of 1868, or even the story of China and the memories that the Chinese have carried with them to this day of the Opium Wars the two opium wars of 1839 and 1856, when the Chinese, because their king refused, their emperor said, we will not allow Europe, especially Britain, to sell opium to us anymore. And the British waged war, at that time controlling the high seas, against the Chinese to say, no, you must import opium. It's good business for us. It may be killing your people, but you must, that opium, if you stop it, you are attacking free trade. And we insist on free trade. And we will enforce free trade. And that's how Hong Kong was lost to the British, as part of the settlement after the war, to surrender Hong Kong, to surrender other territories to the British and the Europeans. And all of the lessons of that humiliation carried forward led to the overthrow of the Qing dynasty in China and set the stage for the making of the Chinese Revolution in 1849. And many of us, of course, who read initially about the Chinese Revolution were convinced that these were revolutionaries driven by a Marxist ideology adapted to its Chinese context. And there was that. There was a struggle for social justice. But fundamentally was that idea of a Chinese nationalism that says, never again shall we be humiliated. And the story of China, I think we've heard it earlier today, ever since the Chinese Revolution has been that nobody is going to kick us around again in this world. Not easily. And nobody will impose the humiliation of the two opium wars again on us. Take the example of Singapore, which was written off when it broke off from Malaysia. A book was actually written. It's a piece of dust bone that has absolutely no chance of survival. And nobody gave the Singaporeans any chance of surviving. When we read the biography of Lee Kuan Yew, and we see the message that runs through, is one of discovering dignity. And I think it's important for us as Africans. We've suffered enough in the world. We've been through slave trade. We've been through colonialism. We are living through a neo-colonial period. We are kicked around. Where we try to assert ourselves, we are pummeled. Where we cooperate, we are flattered. Flattered with invitations to summits of all kinds that don't even make sense sometimes. Africa, China, Africa, Russia, Africa, Europe, Africa, America, Africa, Dubai, Africa, Singapore, Africa, Turkey. In 1 year, our leaders can spend the entire calendar attending one summit after the other, where people are flattering us and telling us how nice and important, we are the beautiful bride. Africa is rising. But we are not addressing the fundamental question of saying, when is enough going to be enough? In which we, as Africans, are going to insist that we define the agenda for our continent, set the pace for that agenda, and proceed to build the institutional mechanisms, including the state form and system that will enable us effectively to implement our own agenda. And I'm sure that this may sound like some kind of rabble-rousing thing, but believe you me, I've thought about this so many times, that it is no longer for us a question of doing petty reforms. Petty reforms that are brought to us from outside the continent. Right? People who sit down in Washington at the World Bank and the IMF and think they know what is best for us, and make it look palatable by recruiting a few of us to those institutions to come and sell those messages to us, so that it won't look too bad if it is a certain expert Mukandala who comes to Tanzania to tell the Tanzanian government, you need to do this, but carrying a World Bank card. Whilst in the meantime, we are not listening to our own intellectuals and policymakers at home who live through these problems and processes with us, as to be able to give us more proximate and accurate responses to the challenges we face. And it seems to me that the moment of transformation for Africa, our road to greatness, will only begin when we begin to learn self-respect, when we begin to understand that the world does not owe us a living, when we also begin to understand that in the world of diplomacy, if you are foolish, the name of the game is to make you even more foolish. Where you begin to understand that at the end of the day, altruism in international relations is an exception, not the rule of the game. Because in any case, if the Chinese come to Africa today, the Turkish come to Africa today, the Emiratis are also poaching Africa on all sides. Everybody is in a new scramble for our continent. They do that not because they love you, they do it because they are securing their own future. Where the Saudis decide that they will buy land in Mauritius or Madagascar in order to produce wheat, not for the purpose of feeding Madagascar, but of ensuring that they can feed their people in Saudi Arabia. That is the name of the game. And the sooner we woke up to it and understood that the destiny of our continent is going to be built by us, nobody else will come to help us, no matter how much they proclaim love for us, no matter the amount of solidarity that is effused whenever we have state visits. It is us who have to have our heads on our shoulder and find that moment of self-respect and collective dignity that will help us to transform our continent. Character builds the individual and of the citizen, but it is actually dignity that transforms the nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Olukoshi. Now, let me invite Professor Katumanga to deliver his presentation. You're welcome.
Thank you. My brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, it is with humility that I come here to share a few reflections and notes on the character and nature of the African state. My brother Olukoshi has already given you the broad outline. What he failed to just indicate out to you is that he added another concept, the nation-state crisis, that is 1996. On top of that, Professor Mkandala and Dar Es Salaam University, I'm very humbled. I'm still very sorry I couldn't make it last year. I'm humbled for several reasons. One is that every now and then you force us to make reflections over a number of situations that in most cases, like in my paper, I've tried to capture the last component of it as the Kiswahili saying, Nairobi tunasema, majuto kawaida ni nani? Mjukuu. Sasa kwetu sisi hapa hivi, when you think about story of Nyerere, about very serious regrets. And so I try to grapple within myself to understand probably where the problem is in response to some of the issues raised today and yesterday. And I thought one best way of trying to capture this is to go back to the maps. And so I have a map over there which I had to belabor in the night to try and produce, but it's more in terms of trying to understand the concept of the Makata, what you call the Makata Map, and its ability to distort, and the purpose of distortion. In other words, whoever makes a map makes it for a certain kind of a purpose. And so if you look at it, you will notice that in most cases it looks smaller, in other words, in terms of where you locate Africa. And in the reality of things, if you construct your own reality, you will notice that in fact, the US, India, China, and almost 3/4 of Europe would actually fit in that map. But what is so important here is, first, the way a map enables us to symbolize things, the way a map gives us a certain appreciation in terms of conceiving where our threats are, where the friendly territories should be. And in addition to that, it then enables us to do something. It produces the notion of strategic thinking. And within it, that aspect of strategic culture. Why does that become fundamentally important? We have to go back around the period of 1450. And around that period of 1450, if you ask your historians, they will tell you Africa was way ahead of Europe and was having a lot of trade with Asia. But at a certain point, a number of things happen. First, we are told about a voyage that is effected by Mansa Musa's predecessors. They undertake a voyage to the seas. And you will be told the same thing about the Mswahilis in Malindi, who will take Vasco da Gama to where? To India. You'll also be told about Mansa Musa's move across the deserts to go to Makkah. The common denominator there is in terms of how these Africans react to the notion of constructing a map. How do we visualize the world and the way the rest of the world does? The common denominator is that Africans have a problem in conceptualizing maps. And so, when Europeans think about coordinates, hapa hivi ukimuuliza mtu direction kuja university hapa hivi watakwambia nini? Follow this, whatever. Kuna nyumba moja hapa imepaintiwa color red, and you'll find the direction. So why do Europeans think in terms of those mappings and what have you? They will produce navigation schools. But in addition to that, there's a fundamental issue here, geography. So what is geography essentially? There are two elements in geography, the physical geography and the human component of geography. So their main drive has always been what? How do we secure, or how do we respond to challenges of the physical geography? How do we respond to challenges of the human component? And therefore, in between that period, from the time Renaissance begins to the point at which that idea of the Leviathan is evolving in Europe, Hobbes and the rest of them, the fundamental question here is, how do you respond to what you're calling sovereignty? How do you express that sovereignty relative to the population, relative to the government? In other words, what type of governmentalities do you develop to be able to access the population? That will produce three elements that are very critical. One is the relationship between the military, the bureaucracy, and what you're calling infrastructure, which will lead to the fundamental question of how do you then penetrate the society. And so the main objective over here is, how do we access the peasant? How do we bring him under the control of the state? For two things. One, the ability to produce taxes. Two, the fact of producing the people who are going to fight in the army. So the struggles over a state are all about what type of governmentalities will allow that building or that evolving or that consolidating Leviathan to be able to reduce the distance decay within the society. So the whole essence of mapping about how to get access to those resources, about how to secure them, becomes also essentially one way of consolidating a viable state. So all the way through, the most constant element is that in Africa, that process is failed, is left out, and the consequences of it, especially that lack of strategic culture, will lead to the phenomena here we're going to be calling what you call a subjective culture, strategic culture among the elite. So what is so fundamental about Nyerere here is that among those African leaders, he'll be among the first ones to have this notion of thinking in a global sense and to try to have dimensions in terms of projecting what you call alternative histories of Africa. But on the other hand, trying to look at prospective consequences in terms of the failures if things do happen. In effect, Nyerere begins to think about the individual. He thinks about the region, he thinks about the continent, and he arrives at one fundamental conclusion. There is no way meaningful development will take place without a consolidated, viable state. And he will have all these arguments with his compatriots. There are three incidents I can very quickly respond to. The first is when he goes to Nairobi and is meeting Obote and Kenyatta. And he tells them, wewe Kenyatta na Obote, katika nchi zenyu, Uganda na Kenya, kuna matatizo ya kikabila. And I wish you guys could come together. And we can only come together before independence, because if we come together after independence, we will have a very serious problem in terms of this petty nationalism that is more inclined towards trying to control borders which are not your own. In any case, remember, borders had not been designed for the purposes or for the interests of both Kenyatta and Obote. They refused. Obote talked about bado kidogo, and there was a very big debate around that. The next incident is when Nyerere visits US and is invited for dinner. Sijui kama unkumbuka. Kwake, I think he's ambassador, Gertrude Mungela. And he's asked by an Ugandan lady praising Nyerere about how Tanzania had developed and the new identities that emerged, mambo kikabila hakuna Tanzania. Nyerere akamjibu, those were those days. You listen to that statement, you feel very sad. The third one is he's addressing a meeting and he's asking Tanzanians, watu ambao wanataka tupeleka katika karne ya 21 kwenye basi ya kinini za kikabila. In other words, by the time he was dying, just the same way many people were disappointed that the East African community did not transform into a federation, as a matter of fact, I think he had some bit of regrets in terms of where the Tanzanians are going. I don't know where you are right now, right? But what is fundamental over here in terms of my appreciations is that the geographies as understood by Europeans will produce three strategic thoughts, geopolitical thoughts. One by Mackinda, one by Spikeman, and of course, the maritime one by Mahan. The value of them is the importance of history in terms of how states have evolved and consolidated themselves. And so when the governor was talking about yesterday, and for the first time I had an African bureaucrat trying to conceive the position where Tanzania is relative to the Indian Ocean. That was very fundamentally important. It shows a little bit of that strategic appreciation. So the net effect is that because of that lack of appreciation of the centrality of Africa, the first thing that emerges is the imagination in the minds of Africans and Europeans in terms of the vertical relationship that exists among them. So what you have is a Eurocentric perspective within which Africans always look to Europe, and they have even adopted that kind of a narrative. Today we were talking about donors. Someone, Julius, who is a donor? A donor, is it the Tanzanian with his Tanzanite who doesn't know what value to add on to it? And then somebody else who knows what to do that sends the Tanzanite back to Tanzania and he says, now have a little bit of some dollars over here. That's why you're calling him a donor. The net effect of it is what? Because of that kind of a situation, for Mahan, the whole aspect of controlling the sea enabled America to become what it is today. For the Chinese, the reading of history and the appreciation of the centrality of both the maritime and the land dynamics, what Spikeman was calling the rimland, gives them the necessity now to come up with what they're calling what? The Silk Roads and all this infrastructure that you're seeing within the context of Africa. But what is the response of the Africans? The first is what you're calling predatory cycles of elections. In other words, elections become instruments for consolidation, extraction of resources, but more importantly, if you look at something as basic as what you call illicit flows, financial flows from African states. So you would find that between 2018 June, if you look at the report that came out from Perry, this is a Political Economy Research Institute, what you're saying is that Africans lost about 1.4 billion, right? If you add the interest of 1.8 trillion, rather 1.4 trillion, interest of 1.8 trillion, the totality of it all is that you would abate all your debts and you build all sorts of infrastructure to respond to what you call the distance decay reduction, process. So the net effect is what? It has produced all the aspects we are looking at here in terms of what you call modes and different forms of fragility. And the political leadership in response to that, we try as much as possible to maximize on two variables over here. One is the question of ethnicity, which will be reproduced in a phenomenal kind of a sense, and latent forms of ideological construction. So what happens here is what? The reality of the people, right, is constructed in a very illusory kind of manner to facilitate the consolidation of political power among the political elite. And so a combination of both what Gramsci and others would have called the centaur. Here you're talking about what? Both violence and the ability to manufacture consent. So how do you manufacture consent? You manufacture consent by feeding people on an ideology of what you're calling ethnicity. So you're back to what Nyerere was warning. At the end of it all, what you're trying to say is that as we move away from a region, we then become to the petty nations, and then after you finish the petty nations, you're back in the village. The description Nyerere gives about petty nation is in Kiswahili, vinji vidogo vidogo, you know? Mjerumani na ujeuri wake amepiga Ulaya mzima, Mfaransa na ukatili wake, Uingereza wote pamoja wameungana pamoja, wamefanya nini? Wametengeneza what you call jumuiya ya Ulaya. Mwafrika naye je? We're still grappling with the fundamental question of what? Ethnic dimensions and all that. So the net effect of it, a wide set of questions, issues, a wide set of challenges which we can represent on in a map just for us to get a general idea of our situation. So the first is what you call the Arc of Instability. If you look at the whole Central Africa all the way to Somalia, we can go further up and we look at the common denominator there in terms of what you call organized banditry activities and how they're looting the state left and right, from the top to the end, from drugs, supply of arms, trafficking, militia groups, human trafficking. All that is targeting the three elements we talked about: the human resource factor, the material resource factor, and if you remove that, then the process of how you operationalize the sovereignty of a state is constantly under flux or a threat. And that is why that arc of instability comes in. But if you move very fast, you will see this map that was produced by one American general sometime, that was in the early 90s. That is the visualization of non-state actors in terms of reimagining what you call the caliphate, what it was all about. So if you see the totality of it all, you can see a strategic thinking in terms of controlling certain strategic points which will have an impact on the control of the African continent itself. So if you move beyond that, you will notice one common denominator there. That if you look at those maps, whether you are concentrating on what is happening in Mozambique, Tanzania point over here, or what is happening in Congo over here, where you have ISIS of Central Africa province, or whether you're having Al-Qaeda of this particular point, or whether you're having this group, the common denominator is that Africa is internally being surrounded and being, what you call, in French you call it grignotage, you know, it's being undermined from within and setting it to a certain kind of reconstruction and a collapse. If you look at this map, this is the new strategic appreciation of what used to be, what was called by Barnett as the Pentagon map, is the flip side of the dependency Wallerstein theory of marginalization and all that. But in this case, the argument is that all these states in that area there are non-consolidating or non-integrating gap in themselves. So one option of dealing with that is how the Chinese see that as an alternative and therefore come up with the infrastructure. The good advantage about them is they have a way of motivating Africans to pay for the infrastructure, which is not bad, right? The flip side of it all is in terms of the African strategic thinking about that, which is very subjective. And so the implication is that either elites are involved in predating on the amounts of money is involved, or two, they are very state-centric in nature. That state-centric logic produces the next level of clashes among states over what these infrastructure platforms that would have been very good in reducing what you're calling the distance decay among states, but in fact also consolidating them to make them very viable as states in themselves. So in effect, what we're saying is that at the end of it all, because of that kind of challenge that you have in the state with respect to the distance decay and what have you, and the sea lines of communication, the continent is constantly under other threats. So one of the things that we are likely to see sooner than later is hybrid wars. We're also likely to see the kind of predation that is taking place that undermines the state in terms of what you call subversion. So ethnicity here becomes another form within which the state is subverted, and its securitization agenda then begins to foil right from the onset. So very quickly, what then should be the agenda of the state in this case here? You're saying you need a strategic, or rather a leadership with a very strong objective strategic culture. You need a weapon of theory, and that weapon of theory has to revolve or to resolve the questions of state weakness by trying to respond to basic strategic issues here. I think one of the best strategic responses to the challenge in Africa was Kagame's statement 2 days ago, in which he has pledged, I don't know how many billions, to ensure that Rwanda begins to produce food for the rest of Africa. In other words, when Africans are going to Ukraine or are going to Russia and they're trying to ask the presidents of Russia and Ukraine about the problems of Africans who are going to die out of anger, I think it's a very big joke. The third element here is in terms of countering the ethnic ideology hegemony. And then, of course, you have the regionalized appreciation of the dynamic. We have no choice, and I think that is the task of the current elite. We have to visit Tiaba and talk to the spirits of Nyerere and say, we are sorry, and see how we can federate East African community. Some of you may not be aware, but that the framework for which European Economic Union was built has actually roots from what was happening in the East African community. But then what happened? We crashed the East African community for very subjective reasons. One of the actors in Kenya who, when he clashed with the regime and the commission was set up, Charles Njonjo, one of the accusations was that he sabotaged the East African community. But that is very far away from a larger part of the reality in terms of the accumulations and the collapse of the whole entire infrastructure, which then has led us to the situation where we are.
Prof, could you please conclude in 1 minute?
Yes, 1 minute? Yes.
Yep.
Right? And so lastly, what you're trying to say is how then we maximize on all these dynamics to begin finding a way forward with the one last fundamental issue. If all these non-state actor symmetrical groups are mobilizing themselves under a region-centric approach to trying to deconstruct the state as we understand it today, Nyerere's option of a unified response, a militarized response towards securing the continent becomes very fundamental here, but that has to be built up in relation to that process of creating what you call the center of gravity of a state. And the center of gravity of the state always revolves around the population, it revolves around their government, and it revolves around their military forces. And that is why his notion of the Tanzania People's Defense Forces was born. But in this case, especially in East Africa, there is the question of how to deal with the problem in Mozambique, the problem in Kenya, Somalia situation, Great Lakes region, in which then the convergence of, say, gas, water, coltan, and these rare earth resources provides a platform within which states in the regions can build what you call a strategic platform for engagement and building viable states from the region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Katmanga, for that very insightful presentation on strategic mapping. Now let me invite Professor Benedetta Killian to present on the topic on inclusion and participation.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me recognize the presence of the former Prime Minister, Honorable Mizengo Pinda, who is here with us, all distinguished guests, professors, students, leaders of political parties, our students from secondary schools, all protocol observed. When I was given this topic by Reddit, inclusion and participation, just like that, then I asked myself, okay, what is it that I'll write about? And then last week I was invited to comment on the biography, Nyerere biography, written by Professor Shivji and Professor Saida and Dr. Kamata. And when I was reading that book, I came to this section whereby it was reported that Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, or father of the nation, back in 1944, when he was a second-year student at Makerere University, he wrote a paper, an essay paper, as a student on women oppression. So this was back in 1944. A young, guy writing about gender equality and women oppression. And then I said, okay, I'm going to change the title. So I changed the title. And my title reads as follows: Inclusion and Participation, Women's Struggles for Engendering the African State. Then I asked myself, by the way, what has happened since then? Since 1944, when Mwalimu wrote that essay, which actually won an award according to the book, until today, what has happened? And then I asked myself, so what's the relationship between African state and women? Period. What is the relationship? And I've been following the discussion here since morning, at least when I joined in. I've never heard anybody mentioning women. Even when we were discussing about the African state, about Pan-Africanism, where are the women? What is the fate of women? How do they relate with the state? And this question becomes actually very serious. You know why? Because women are the majority all over the world, in all over many countries, constituting about 51% of the population, even here in Tanzania. So why are we not talking about them when we discuss all these issues? And let me make reference to the young girl who asked about where are the youth. I'm asking, where are the women? I don't know whether you can hear me. Where are the women? And I really like the presentation by the ambassador, the ambassador, Mount, I don't know where he is. And when he was discussing the challenges of African Union, I was like, okay, now he's going to mention gender inequality. He didn't. He didn't. But anyway. So here I would like to begin my presentation by stating the following. First of all, the African state is exclusionary. It's very exclusionary and therefore less inclusive. Second submission, I'm going to say, the exclusion is gender-based, where women are excluded in various spheres compared to men. Third thing, I'm arguing that the relationship between the African states and citizens is gendered, and therefore you have to look at it with a gender lens. In this regard, therefore, the state has turned out to be a critical avenue, critical site for women's struggles. So it's good that we have the state because it provides space for women's struggles to make sure that the state becomes less exclusionary, becomes inclusive, and become participatory. So I'll start with just a general discussion, if time allows me, and then I will use Tanzania as a case study But more specifically, I'm going to use the constitutional review process of 2014, 2012, 2013, 2014 as a case study of how women struggled to engender the state. And I will use my own experience because I was there as a member of the Constituent Assembly briefly. So let me say, start by saying that in order to examine the status of gender-based domination and marginalization versus the state, gender relations must be understood in the context of power relations. And these gender relations, by the way, are not static, but they change, they are dynamic, they change over time. And in so doing, it's very important. In so doing, it's very important that when we discuss gender, we have to discuss it with its historicity across time and space. Also, the discussion on gender equality should be interrogated in two fronts. On the one hand, there is what we call the equity argument, which makes the case that women have a right to participate in decision-making in proportion to their numbers as a distinct group in society. In this case, numbers matter. Because sometimes you hear people, oh, you guys, you only talk about numbers. They matter. And studies have shown that you need a critical mass of women in various decision-making in order to make influence. The second front is about what is known as efficacy argument. This is what women brings to the decision-making process. Women bring different perspectives and experience which makes governance better and achieve more results. For example, studies have shown that women leaders are said to be more likely to use conciliatory measures than male leaders. So don't get surprised when President Samia Suluhu Hassan, trying to do what she does. Actually, studies have shown that women leaders are more conciliatory. But also, studies have also indicated that, for example, in India, it was found that women-led councils have 62% higher rate of water projects than the councils led by men. Research in Norway found out that there is a direct causal relationship between women's presence in municipal councils and child care coverage. Also, studies have found that women demonstrate political leadership by working across party lines through parliamentary women's caucus. Even in the most politically combative environment, they collaborate and work together, despite of their diversity. Another important thing to be taken into account here when we analyze the relationship between gender and the state, or women and the state, is that a critical analysis is required in order to be able to make a distinction between what appears to exist on the surface and what lies beneath. This is very critical in order to avoid the oversimplification and the romanticism when we analyze the relationship between gender and the state. For example, a good example in Tanzania these days is, now that we have a female president, you will hear some people, especially men, saying that we have gender equality, this is enough. You say enough is enough. But if you just go a little bit underneath, you will actually realize that we have a long way to go, and gender inequality still exists, as I will try to show shortly. Also, another important thing to take in mind is about the relationship, and this is very interesting. The relationship between the state and the women is full of ambiguities, disguises, contradictions, and contestations. For instance, while there's been some argument in the literature on the link between representative democracy and gender equality, other studies have indicated that having a representative democracy does not actually guarantee gender equality. even having a multi-party system with political parties in place, and that's why struggles for gender equality continues, even in the so-called well-established democracies like in the US and somewhere else. At times, women's movements are being promoted by the state, are being supported, but also sometimes they are being manipulated, and sometimes they are being opposed or crushed by the state. At times, women are encouraged to participate. Like all the time we say, women should participate in various forums by being active participants. But when they do so, they are being labeled as intruders, being anti-African, being, Western feminists. So that's kind of a contradiction. But even with the UN Sustainable Development Goal number 5.5, which states that, which actually requires government to achieve full and effective participation and equal opportunities for leadership at all levels by 2030. And in addition to that, almost all constitutions have clauses against gender discrimination. Many countries are signatories of to international and regional instruments and human rights, instruments on human rights and women's rights and gender equality. Indeed, almost every new constitution made since 1945 includes provision on gender equality. Yet, the state is still exclusionary. To me, this is ionic. Why? And if you go back to history, to pre-colonial times, to colonial times, during the struggle for independence, women played quite a significant role here in Tanzania, in South Africa, in Zambia, in Malawi, all over the place. But then, their work becomes invisible. This is what Zeleza calls invisibilization of women's history. It's not written that much. For example, here, if I ask the young, students from secondary education whether they have heard of Bibi Titi Mohammed, probably yes, probably no. So this is an issue of invisibilization. Ironically, at the level of women's representation and participation increases, and so is the gender-based violence, also increases. When you have high number of women in various organs, then the resistance system inakuja, and then it starts crashing the gender equality achievements. And here there is a report by ACLED which shows that political violence targeting women in public sphere all over the world has almost doubled. Africa, Central Asia, and Europe. So in general, my submission here is more in line with one scholar who said that rather than just categorize African states as being deeply entrenched in what some scholars call patriarch authoritarianism, the relationship between men, and the state should be studied by looking at the state at the site or terrain of struggles, where domination and gender-based exclusion can be deconstructed and reconstructed, towards emancipation. And therefore, it becomes very crucial for various actors to engage with the states, including women, in order to transform it. And of course, the state is not a fixed entity. It's a network of power relations in which competing groups seek to capture state power, including women. They also want to capture state power. For the benefit of time, let me say, despite of all the struggles that women have waged over time, over the years, yet gender inequalities exist. If I can give you statistics from the latest Global Gender Gap Index of last year, this index measures economic participation and opportunity, educational attainment, health and survival, and political empowerment. And it shows that as this pace, given this pace and speed of interventions towards gender equality, it will take 135 years to close the gender gap worldwide. In Africa, actually, it will take 145 years to close the gender gap. Also, what we call Africa Barometer also states that the glaring inequality still exists in Africa. So, I have 3 minutes. Patriarchy. So let me go back to my case study of the constitutional review process of 2014. During that time, if you recall, in the discussion, there was very heated debate on the structure of the union. It was the struggle to deconstruct the state. But who wanted to deconstruct the state? Political parties. Who leads political parties? You can answer that question. So the debate in the parliament was dominated by whether we want serikali moja, serikali mbili, or serikali tatu to deconstruct the state. And they were thinking about their own political powers and positions. But then women were smart, and they started organizing, irrespective of their political affiliation. You had Mama Anna Abdallah from CCM, Susan Limo from Chadema, leading women. They used to meet in the evening while men were busy fighting for serikali tatu au moja au mbili. All the women, regardless of their political party affiliation, used to meet almost every day in the evening after the session, or Saturdays, to discuss on the way forward in order to influence the content of the Katiba Pendekezwa, if I can use that term. And there were various gender-based organizations that were involved in building capacity for women, including TAMWA, TGNP, TAULA, WILDAF, ULINGO, all these organizations. And what women were asking, a series of issues. They wanted a constitution that embeds principle of gender equality. They wanted gender parity, 50-50, abolition of customary law, a need to define the age of a child in order to eliminate early marriages, right to safe reproductive and maternal health, etc., etc. The list is long. And what happened after that? In this draft constitution here, this one, actually women got a lot of what they wanted. In the draft constitution, and if you go through the list of what they wanted, for me, this is a very good case of women's attempt to engender the state, to deconstruct the state. In the draft constitution, they have a section here that deals with women rights, rights of women, Article 57, children's rights, Article 53, rights of the aged, Article 48, rights of people with disability, Article 58. But the big victory, because they really fought for this, is Article 129, Section 4. And this Article 129, Section 4 provides for 50-50 in the constituency elections. So whereby each electoral constituency is supposed to include both a male and a female as candidates. So each political party is supposed to put 2 candidates, female and a male, and people go and vote. And so my point here is, this is one case study whereby Tanzanian women struggled quite very hard to engender the state, to deconstruct the state. And the constitutional review process provided a golden opportunity for this to happen. But you know what happened. The process was stalled, the constitution was not enacted, and it remains the draft constitution. A very well-written document, but just a document. there are many reasons, and I'm concluding. There are many reasons to explain what happened. Some people are saying, oh, that was 2014, it was very close to 2015 elections, and therefore this constitution could not be enacted. My take on this is, it is because of these provisions on gender equality. Period. Men could not bear, or the patriarchal system could not bear going to elections of 50-50 formula. Going to elections whereby you are going to have a parliament where you have 50% male, 50% female. So for us, that's why I'm going back to my analytical framework. When we talk about the relationship between gender and the state, we have to go, numbers are important, but let's go beyond numbers and try to underscore what is underneath. For me, if I try to assess what took place in that process, there are several reasons that stopped that to be instituted, the Constitution. But the issue of gender equality is also one of them. Ladies and gentlemen, I rest my case. I'm waiting for questions to answer.
Thank you very much, Professor Benedetta Killian, and for that very powerful kind of conclusion, activistic kind of. Now it's time for questions and answers, and please be very precise, straight to the point. We don't have a lot of time with us, so two hands, one hand over there. Okay, I used to be a leftist, so let me start from this side.
Thank you for the chance. I'm Maya Gerfes, a student in UDUTIM. My question is about the lecture on state. I'm asking that you say that you need to identify our self-respect and the issue of identity. Simply, I want to ask that, can you give us a simple definition of what is identity? And you give us several example from US, Asia, Europe, but you didn't give any example on Africa history. We don't have any good example about dignity in Africa history. Thank you. To the first presenter.
All right. Okay. So, yeah, you can start from there.
Thank you so much. My question goes to Professor Musambai Kamutanga. Last year, 2021, I was given an opportunity to offer, my insight on the form and substance of the January 2021 Ugandan parliamentary and presidential elections at Makerere University. And surprisingly, in those discussions that we're having, what came to be realized was that there was an issue to do with the politics of identity, or call it identity politics, okay? And now the discussion went further to link, to take us back to what happened, or the question of ethnicity. So, and that brought an issue of, it may be a problem to promote the African dream of Pan-Africanism. Now, from a practical point of view, based on your rich history, what mechanisms can be put in place to suppress the question of identity politics, which in my opinion, probably as yours as well, is a disaster for the Pan-African dream of Africa? Asante.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, I was trying to comment on Professor Kilian to buy Professor Katumanga words of strategic thinking and how people are being fed by ethnically. I think Dr. Kilian is trying to make an ideology construction. Because here we are talking about a gender issue. And gender issue, we think that let us not talk about numbers, talk about quality. You can find a society whereby women are more qualified. Therefore, you can put 10 women and only 1 man. Therefore, the 50-50 issue, I don't think is the issue to put on a foot so that it will make us think that women are not good people, or they are not intelligent, or they are not quality. We need quality, people so that they can lead the country. If it is 10 to 2, then 10 women, 2 men. If it is 50-50, okay. But putting 50-50, I don't think that it is a good idea. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is going to be very exciting, I believe. Yes, over there. The next one over there. Below, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Got some questions. I am going to address especially to Dr. Kilian. The first question is, do you think there is any relationship between our daily lives and the issue of gender equality? Do you think there is any relationship?
We can't hear you. Can you lower your mic, please, a little bit?
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you think there is any relationship between our daily lives and the issue of gender equality? If there is, what is it? And if not, why? The second question is, there has been differences between whether organizations or countries, especially those led by women and those by men. So do you think why there has been the differences of development, especially on those organizations or countries led by women and those led by men? Do you think why there has been differences? Thank you, Laura.
Thank you. Well, I have a question to Dr. Kilian Professor Kilian, sorry, that is there any relationship between preservation of our culture, African culture, and gender equality? Because we see that we are having problems of preserving our culture and attaining the the gender equality in Africa? And also, I want to ask that, is it true that for women themselves are the reason that we cannot get gender equality? As I'll go directly to the issue of political participation, that women themselves, they're having the culture of denying participating in political issues, whereas we cannot find the spaces or the places of the women into political activities. Thank you.
Let's have the last question for this round. This side. Over there. Over there.
Thank you so much. My name is Deodatus Balile. Listening to the two eminent professors, Msambani and the Olukoshi, they are all struggling to answer the question, where have we failed? And listening to the histories they are passing around, China and Africa, we were almost at par, or we were ahead of them in 30 years ago. Now I ask myself, have you, both of you professors, navigated what Deng Xiaoping installed to the Chinese in 1979 to transform them to where they are now, and to make sure our countries, wherever we travel across the world, we meet products labeled made in, let's say, Tanzania. You are from Nigeria. Have you met any product here in Tanzania labeled made in Nigeria? Do you think we can make it through aiding? Why are we not venturing into trading?
Let's have two questions from students over there. Two questions from students. Direa. The two of you over there, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm from Dar Es Salaam Secondary School. My name is Justin. My question is to Professor Kirian, the last presenter. And the question says that the women are in need of equality. For this case, the government and the other non-governmental organization tries to empower them. But remind you that there is a violence and injustice even to the male gender, I mean boys. But in the government and the other angels put all effort to empower women. What about in the male gender? Since nowadays, there is increasing case of sodomizing boys, violence to the boys and the involvement of boys in civil wars, especially in countries such as DRC and other countries which are unstable in terms of political instability. For our side of Tanzania, there is increasing case of sodomizing the boys. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, please. Another student from secondary school. Yes.
Thank you for the appreciation. And my question is to Professor Orukushi. And it's about that. I saw it was written there, the securization agenda of Africa. That's one of the reflection was need for disciplined long-range planning institution. And Mr. Orukushu said that when will enough be enough? So if we want enough to be enough, as you say that we have some reflections, but still the African agenda is not secured. So what can you do? What can we do so that enough to be enough? Also, may I take this opportunity to comment on the gender visibilization of the women's even government in other countries in Africa. First of all, we have to conserve, and we have first to deal with small matters of women that have arisen in our country. Example, we have heard nowadays currently the case of many people who have been raped, of many women who have been raped, and many cases of children who have been treated oppressively. In order to make the visibilization of the women, first of all, we have to deal with more matters that deals with the women, so as to make the respect and obedience on the women. Thank you.
Very much. I have here from one of the participants addressed it to Professor Olukoshi. What form of state should Africa adopt? He says enough is enough and never again. Whether a nationalist, a developmental state, a welfare state, or what kind of state would you suggest? So let me start with Professor Killian.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for comments and for questions about my presentation. Let me say this. First of all, there was a question about boys. You know, when we talk about gender relations, it's about men and women, the relationship between men and women in a particular society across time and space. So even boys are also part of this discussion. When we discuss, for example, when we give figures of women, let's say, representation in the parliament, we compare it with men. So the issue of gender should be understood very clearly, that it covers both men and women. Another point that I would like to bring across, the gender issue is both. It's a human rights issue, but also it's a developmental issue. Human rights issue in terms of we are all created equal. Our constitutions actually provides for this equality before the law, regardless of sex, whether you are a man or a woman, race, ethnicity, disability, or any other considerations. So it's a human rights issue, and you cannot run away from it. My colleague there who said, why 50-50? Because it's a human rights issue. There's no debate about that. And there's no activism, by the way, Professor Bakari. It's just data, statistics, and analysis. And the second issue is about development. And studies have shown, and here I'm referring to research that has been done all over the world, that actually when you have an inclusive society, that brings about different perspectives on the table, different experiences, for that matter, from all kinds of groups in society, then there is a high chance that this country is going to have sustainable development. And there are countries like that. So whether you like it or not, for Tanzania, for instance, to develop, it has to be inclusive. All groups must be included in the developmental process, in the decision-making process. There's no shortcut. So that's number two. Number three, it's about the issue of culture. Somebody talked about culture, which I agree with you. And there are good things also in our African culture that needs to be emulated, like respect for each other. That's very good. So what I want to bring across here is not everything in African traditions is bad. No. There are some good things, but there are some other practices, norms, traditions, and values that discriminate against women or other groups. And it's very important to realize that compared to men, women tend to face various obstacles that prevent them from effective participation, either in political participation or in the job market. For example, time poverty.
you know, this distinction between the private and the public sphere. Women tend to dominate the care, what we call these days the care economy, taking care of the households, taking care of the sick, the elderly, children, cooking, looking for water. So as a result, they tend to have very limited time to participate as effectively as men. That's what we call time poverty. That's a problem. And we have several interventions to make sure that that problem is addressed. Economic barriers, illiteracy, you know, the level of education, all these tend to affect men or boys, girls than boys. So that's all I can say. Thank you very much, and thank you for comments.
Thank you very much for being precise in spite of the fact that so many questions were addressed to you. Now let's continue with the Professor Olukoshi.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, colleagues, for the questions. Let me just say, as an aside, that the question of parity, male-female parity, in my view, and in complement to what colleague Professor Killian has contributed, is also an exercise in ensuring inclusivity and sustainability of the kind that can enable us to make an important leap forward in our development. In the history of political societies around the world, there are two ways in which you can bring about change. And one of them is actually through legislation and the use of quota, where you have marginalized communities. Even if it is a time-bound approach which you employ, you can actually decide that you will create quotas that will enable them to be included in a process. And that quota can apply as much to women, as to the youth, as to people living with disability, as to ethnic minorities. It's a whole gamut of groups, all for the sake of ensuring the sustainability of a political system, and as well as its legitimacy, ultimately. So I'm very much comfortable with the idea of parity. And many of our countries have actually signed up to conventions, both continental and international, committing us to implementing certain reforms. I'm sure we did not have a gun put to our sign the Maputo Protocol. It was a voluntary instrument, and almost every African country, bar one or two, acceded to that protocol and signed on to it, in addition to those that have been produced under the auspices of the United Nations. African history and examples of success stories. Look, let me just clarify. I mean, my whole thrust is not to suggest that we have not had occasions in our history when collective dignity has actually triumphed in our efforts to build progress. And if you read the accounts of Basil Davidson, or you read the works of Walter Rodney, which was cited in passing here earlier on, you will see examples of successes in statecraft and nation building. And the important lesson to take from those historical examples, as much as the comparative examples through the history of Europe, through the history of Asia, and the history of Latin America, which I cited, is precisely the same point that I have made, that a point arrives where, whether by reform or by revolution, a people say that enough is enough. And it doesn't actually always have to be about an external power relationship which you seek to correct. Sometimes it's actually about, in fact, a lot of times it's about internal injustices and disequilibria in the system that you seek to correct. The French Revolution was about social inequality within France itself. And that became a key driver of change, in which from demanding to have bread, a generalized strike then became a demand for liberty, equality, and fraternity, a demand for dignity. for the people. And you can extrapolate from that across different experiences of change that we have seen both historically and contemporaneously to see the central place. Now, there's a concept which has been used quite a lot in the literature, which those who are political scientists here will be familiar with. And that's the notion of what I prefer to call the leadership consensus, of a leadership group that Guillermo O'Donnell called it the elite consensus, which is a bit, can be a bit pejorative, but the leadership group across sectors of society who actually set broad rules of behavior and conduct on the basis of which politics and the developmental project will be carried out as a way of ensuring societal transformation. So I think my message is not to say that we haven't had experiences, but in dealing with our contemporary situation on the African continent, we can look back to our history and look to the examples of others, not with a view to mimicking what others have done. We've done too much of mimicking since 1960, since independence, but rather to learn from those experiences in order to build institutions and processes that work for us and work effectively. And that begins to be the starting point of self-respect. All of us in this room, many of us in this room, are self-respecting people. We live with neighbors who are self-respecting. But individual self-respect should be distinguished from collective self-respect. If you have a situation, and the example was cited when the discussion on the AU took place, in which you have to depend on the Chinese to build your African Union headquarters for you and donate it to you, makes it a bit difficult to swallow, right? You are not actually even doing the architectural design to reflect your environment. The thing just stands out like that. I lived in Addis for 7 years and was a representative to the African Union, and sometimes I found it very hard to go in there. And you go in and then African officials are telling you that, you know, the Chinese have put things in the walls. And I say, excuse me, but what did you expect? They built it for you. They are still sitting on the 18th floor of the building, telling you that they are doing maintenance, and you are telling us that they are listening to everything that you are doing in Beijing. Please wake up. And that's what I mean by collective dignity. What would it have cost us as Africans to say, people of Africa, we are starting a new effort at Pan-Africanism, moving from the OAU to the AU. We ask every African who is able to donate $1 in your local currency. And we will collect this through your government and build this African Union. It could have been done. And we are talking of moving from an AU of leaders to a union of the people. And then we had no hesitation collecting a gift from the Chinese. Of course, the Chinese love us. But love yourself and respect yourself. You cannot have a situation perpetually where you keep a dependency mentality. When you have a problem, your shoe pinches you, your first instinct is to look outside and say, we need aid. We need to find a donor. If you don't like the word donor, we change it to partner. We need to find a partner, knowing that there's no partnership in all of these relationships. I can go on for the whole day on this issue, but the chair will not allow me. Deng Xiaoping, I think your observation on Deng Xiaoping really does tally with the message I think we are trying to convey here. We're not trading with ourselves enough. You had that panel in the morning, excellent panel, with the colleague from Trademark Africa. We've heard since yesterday, even from our keynote speaker, of all of the constraints. And I'll give you one very concrete example. New president arrives in Botswana, says, I want to change direction. My predecessor did not attend the AU once throughout his 8 years or 9 years. Didn't believe too much in this AU and African things. He was ready to impose sanctions on Zimbabwe, Mugabe Zimbabwe, and so on and so forth. I want Botswana to be part of the African mainstream. We are Africans. And I need new policy proposals across the board. I was invited to attend a meeting on tourism, reform of the tourism sector. I said, why do you build your strategy on the assumption that the only tourists who count and matter are those who come from Europe and America? Why? In Tanzania, aren't Tanzanians qualified to be tourists? Does Greece or France build its tourism policy on the basis of the number of Africans who will come? And this then translates into your range of policies around foreign exchange, around visas, around, even the construction of hotels and tour companies and the like. And secondly, you say you believe in the African Continental Free Trade Area. How come you are not trying to attract African tourists to Botswana? Why is it that the idea that the foreign investor must be white, male, and European or American? Can't Africans be investors also? And these are the kinds of things which I think we need to retune our mentality. That issue also came up earlier, that it's a mindset in the trade session. It's the mindset. We need to change that mentality. And that means we begin to believe in ourselves. If you are doing a policy that you think is good, do it for the sake of Tanzania, not for the sake of somebody else. If you are doing something that you think is good, do it for the sake of your own people in the first instance. We assume a lot of the times that to be universal is a good thing. But remember, the universal started from the local. Everything that is universal began from the local, addressing a specific local question. Nobody sits down in the United States coming with a universal idea for the sake of Tanzania or the sake of Africa. They are thinking of how to solve American problems. If you like, you can come and copy and mimic it later and graft it onto a context that doesn't apply. That's your problem. We are running presidential systems, copying American Constitution, but we forget our own history and the kinds of things that we need to do to address disconnections and disjunctures in our history that will help us to transform ourselves. Sorry, Chair. When is enough? What will it take? Well, reform or revolution, as I said. What form of state? No, let's not be too fixated yet about labeling the state. That, I think, was also part of my message. Welfare state, developmental state, nationalist state, all of those things are good. But you have, in the first instance, to build the kind of self-awareness and consciousness of where you want to go. Where Tanzania is today and where Tanzania will be in the next 50 years, given the demographics that we are aware of, what kind of state should Tanzania be building? I will not label it in advance. I would rather answer the question of how many jobs do you need to create? How are you going to create those jobs? What kind of income levels will be sustainable? What kind of living conditions will need to be achieved? What kinds of balances and equalities in society, including male and female, will need to be achieved in order for us to then begin to give a name to the thing, rather than starting from the other side where you actually name the thing before you create it. And then you begin to actually grapple in it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Katumanga.
As they're trying to project for us the map, just wanted to show you a map of the current East African community. So if we were to assume that we were going in for a federation, I think one of the biggest challenges here is how can we apply our minds to converge certain groups within the Eastern African region to push the reality of that. What you're saying is that if you achieve that, you will have 300 million people. You will have an area that is controlling an area of about 5 million square kilometers. If you have that area of 5 million square kilometers, you have to ask yourself, how then you locate Africa. It becomes a pivot area. So if you eventually move to what Africa is, it becomes an island. It becomes what you call a strategic island. But if you went back to the Shirikisho la Afrika Mashariki on the other side, what you're going to have is a state that will be controlling a wide range of strategic resources, from gas to basically something as strategic as cobalt, which each one of you in this room has right now, if you have telephones and what have you. Okay? But then you got then to ask yourself a fundamental question which we were asked to look at, and that is the question of what we call security, or national security, regional security, whatever name you want to give it. And you arrive at two fundamental issues here. There is first, the core interests that one seeks to achieve or to have, which are very critical to make them have a viable existence. In other words, provide some sense of some liberation from all those things that constrain us. The second aspect of it is when you miss it, and therefore you're characterized as being essentially insecure. So you will tend to have that condition within which the higher the levels of insecurity people feel, the higher the levels of identity crisis people have, and the higher the levels of mobilization towards creating different forms of identity for people to find ways of trying to essentially survive. So the question that you've asked, one person asked with respect to our colleague from Uganda, is that identities are not permanent. They are constructed, they can be deconstructed. Nyerere did it here in Tanzania. We're suffering from that identity question today in Kenya. In Nigeria, it's the same thing, whether it's religious or whether it is sectarian or whether it's ethnic and what have you. The bottom line of it all is that you reduce identities, or you manage what you call militarized identities, to the extent to which you're responding to that phenomena we mentioned earlier, the process of distance decay reduction, economic, political, social, environmental, and the creating that sense of what inclusion within the state, which my colleague has been mentioning all the way through. The net result of it is that the fundamental aspect of what you're calling the viability of a state is about how the physical base of a state, in this case the population, the material resources, the territories, are protected. But in addition to that, and more fundamental, is the question of what type of ideas, and that is what we call strategic culture, which Professor Koshi is pointing to as the question, that fundamental issue of leadership. So when you mention the idea of China, there are three elements that are constant there. One is that appreciation of three things: what you call geography, what you call strategy, and in addition to that, what you call history. When you combine all of them together, you begin to know where you have been, where you are because of where you've been, and where you think you should essentially then go. The second aspect of it is the type of leadership you have. So if you have that leadership that has that first variable, then you'll have the third component, and that is the investment in the people of China. So if you have 1.2 billion people and you are having the same logic in the context of Africa, and you are what you call, in this case, you're what you call the pivot, a pivot island is central in the whole world. So if your political imagination and your strategies that you develop have that kind of a sense, then you can project into what you call the interface nation, you can project into what you call the Pacific Ocean, and you can get into the Atlantic. And at one point or another, you then are able to begin plotting and planning on how to resolve the existing local contradictions that are letting you chasing rats in the midst of a fire, instead of having a bigger view in terms of where you essentially want to go. So I think we are own enemies in terms of our bad visualization of our reality. So what you should be telling Professor Mkandala, and to justify our reason for inviting us over here, is to say, yeah, you have very many thinkers in this place, you have economists, you have all these people together. So why don't you even come up with a draft that can be used to mobilize people? They don't have to accept it, but you'll be saying, if we really wanted to realize the East African community and transform it into Shirikisho la Afrika Mashariki, what will that take? If we cannot arrive at that kind of situation, you keep on marching in these roads about Black Lives Matters and everything. So what? Okay, they matter. Then what? The only way they begin to matter is if there is that dignity. And that dignity begins with the ability to prevent even a very simple basic aspect of a physical capacity degeneration of a state by the way of what? Forced migration of Africans from their own continent to go elsewhere. That capital that is moving out is what is missing out over here. Ni kama mwanamke ambaye, you're not investing in her blood. You're not supplying her with more blood, and she's losing a lot of blood because of the child she's given birth. The child whom she's given birth, you're not providing the environment to ensure that child grows up into something. So we're killing ourselves by this kind of predatory activities we're having. And it's not a question of the lack of a mind or lack of a thinking. It's a question of sometimes we invest in what we call subjective strategic culture instead of a collectivized objective strategic culture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Katumbanga. For the interest of time, I think we have to conclude here. So let me invite Dr. Munisi if there is an announcement. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair, Professor Bakari, and the panelists. Asanteni sana, you can take your seats. Mwenyekiti ananikumbusha, round of applause, please. Asanteni sana, Shenaleng. Paveja. Okay, so now I would like to call to the podium Oscar Nyerere, Mbeba Maono wa Mwalimu Nyerere, to give us a short presentation of 5 minutes, and then I will come up with an announcement. Karibu sana, Oscar.
Ndugu zangu wa Tanzania, nataka niwaeleze wa Tanzania wenzangu, nataka nieleze hivyo wataelewa katika serikali yao. Kwanza nataka niwashukuru kwa kuweza kunialika hapa. Tuekaja alinitumia barua kusema mzee nataka uje. Nikamwambia nitaangalia, nilimwambia hivyo, nakumbuka nilimwambia hivyo. Nikatumiwa tena barua mara ya pili. Nikasema sasa nitakwenda, na kweli nimekuja hapa, na mimi nawashukuru kwa kuweza kuandaa kigoda cha kwangu, maana mwenyewe ni mimi. Unaposema kigoda cha mwalimu unanizungumzia mimi. Kwa hiyo nawashukuru sana. Na ni jambo la heshima sana. Nimefurahi sana kuona kina Profesa Lumumba hawa walikuwa vijana wadogo sana hawa. Ni moja ya watu ambao wazalendo wakubwa katika nchi hii. You are welcome. Nataka niwaambie, wakati nchi yetu ya Tanzania, wakati ule inaitwa Tanganyika, tunapigania uhuru, wakati huo ilikuwa na umri wa miaka 36 wakati huo nakumbuka. Na moja ya hotuba yangu niliwahi kusema kwamba Amini amechokoza, ametangaza sehemu ya mpaka mwa mto wa Kagera kwamba ni mali ya Uganda. Kwa hiyo nikasema tunataka Watanzania wajue na dunia ijue hivyo. Sasa mimi nikawaambia tuna kazi moja tu, ni kumpiga. Sababu ya kumpiga tunayo, nia ya kumpiga tunayo, na uwezo wa kumpiga tunao, na kweli tulimtandika. Amini hilo wanatambua vizuri sana katika serikali yao. Hili wajua kwamba majeshi ya Tanzania si majeshi ya mchezo hata kidogo, hata kidogo. Tuliwaambia hivyo. Kongo huko walikuwa wanajeshi moja hivi, walikuwa wanajiita masonari. Masonari ni jeshi ambalo linafanya kazi kwa fedha tu, kwa fedha. Askari wa masonari, inaweza ikatokea mapigano baina ya nchi hii na nchi hii. Sasa askari wa masonari yeye hana huku wala huku. Akiambiwa huku kuna hela, anatoka huku anakwenda kupigana huku. Akiambiwa huku anakwenda. Kwa hiyo askari wa masonari ukimwambia kwa nini unafanya hivi, anasema nalipwa. Anakuambia nalipwa. Kwa hiyo wenzetu zamani askari wa masonari walikuwa wanafanya kazi kwa fedha. Askari wa masonari alikuwa razi kuua au kuuawa kwa fedha tu, lakini askari wa Tanzania yuko razi kuua au kuuawa sio kwa sababu ya fedha, kwa ajili ya heshima ya nchi yake ya Tanzania. Kwa hiyo tunataka wajue hivyo. Kwa hiyo nataka niwaeleze wa Tanzania, amani hii niliyowaachia nataka muitunze kama wa Tanzania. Tunao viongozi ambao wanafanya kazi nzuri. Mimi wakati ule niliongoza nchi hii, na uongozi huu ni mbio za vijiti tu. Kwa hiyo niliongoza nchi, akaja nikamwachia mzee Mwinyi. Mzee Mwinyi naye akaya akasema kuachia mzee Mkapa. Kwa hivyo kwa Wazanaki tuna kauli moja, tunasema wose maji Kanyanza. Maana sisi sote ni maji yaliyo ziwani. Nataka watangua hivyo na waelewe hivyo kana wa Tanzania. Kwa hiyo mimi niwashukuru sana. Niwashukuru sana na nashukuru sana kuona kwamba viongozi wetu wa dini ni watu ambao wanahakikisha amani ya nchi yetu ya Tanzania inatawala. Na ndiyo maana hata wakati nilipomkamata yule Mgiriki kwa rushwa aliyokuwa anasema serikali yote kwa mfukoni mwangu, nikasema huyu ana mifuko mikubwa kiasi gani ya kuweza kutuhifadhi sisi, maana yake serikali ni sisi. Sasa wakaja wazee wakaniomba pale, waliomba huyu ikaja barua kutoka kwa askofu mmoja alikuwa anaitwa Askofu Makarius, akaniomba kwamba mzee msamee, huyu amefanya jambo la kipumbavu. Na upumbavu si tusi, upumbavu ni furusieji tu, upumbavu. Furusieji. Kwa hiyo nikamsamee yule, kasema nitamtoa. Kwa hiyo nikamtoa kwa sababu ya kuheshimu maaskofu, nilimheshimu Askofu Makarius. Kwa hiyo nataka watu watambue kwamba maaskofu hawa, watumishi hawa, au viongozi wa dini hawa, maaskofu, mashehe, wana mchango mkubwa sana katika nchi yetu ya Tanzania. Sijui mnanielewa? Kwa hiyo baada ya kutamka hayo, mimi sitaki niwe mzungumzaji sana na uzee huu, wakati mwingine unaweza ukajikuta unatoa na siri za serikali. Kwa hiyo baada ya kutamka hayo niseme Mungu ibariki Afrika, Mungu ibariki Tanzania. Asanteni sana kwa kunisikiliza wa Tanzania wenzangu. Asanteni sana.
Okay. Tunaona mwalimu na mwanae wanapiga picha bwana Father and son Mwanao amekuomba kupiga picha. Sio kawaida yako.
Nimemwona mtoto wangu hapa Madaraka huyu zamani na kaka na mdogo wake walikuwa wajanja sana. Sasa na nataka niwaambie kule kwetu Butiama pale tuna makumbusho kubwa sana pale. Kwa hiyo tunawaomba sana Watanzania mfike kutembelea kwa ajili ya kuja kupata historia yangu yote iko pale. Kwa hiyo nawaomba sana Watanzania tufike pale Butiama, makumbusho mazuri yako pale. Na mkifika pale, kwa sababu nikawaambia watoto wangu sio wote mjazane mjini, nikamwambia Madaraka utabaki huko. Kwa hiyo niwashukuruni sana, asante sana.
Thank you very much. Asante sana. So one announcement, it's time to break for lunch. So the VIP people will go where we go. I think the ushers can guide us, and the rest of us who have coupons will just go to the tent outside the main building. We lunch.